few years ago. Of those 8, it now looks like 4 succeeded, which means three of them have been bought. Reddit was actually a merger of 2, Infogami and Reddit, that got bought. And there was a third one that got bought by a giant paranoid company. I'm not allowed to talk about it. There was also a 4th looped from that batch, which is probably the most successful of the lot, and can get bought in 10 minutes if they wanted to, but they don't want to. So that means 50% of the founders from that first batch are now rich, at least by their standards. When you get rich, there are actually many different degrees of it. Those guys have Wall Street, let's just put it that way. But neither do I. Okay, so I don't really think we're going to be able to keep up that 50% rate. Maybe that sample size was just a little small, maybe it was an anomalous batch. But I think we'll do a lot better than the mythical and probably made up 10%. So I would be willing to guess 25% long term. However, here's another statistic. The guys who failed did not really have a terrible time. There are 3 startups from that first 8 that are now definitely dead. 2 of them just went off and did other things at the end of the summer. I don't think they were traumatized by the experience. The closest thing to a traumatic failure was Kiko, which kept working on their startup for another year before being squished like a bug by a little calendar. However, those guys auctioned off their software on eBay for $250,000, paid off their angel investors, had a year's salary left, and then went off and started a new and much more exciting startup that Google will never be able to compete with in a million years, Justin.tv. Are they here, by the way? If they are, you're all on TV. Cell phones off, dudes. Okay, so here's a really interesting statistic. Of those 8 batches, the number who would have traded it for a job in a cubicle, 0%. I don't know if we're going to be able to keep up the 50% success rate, but I feel pretty sure that this 0% number is not an anomaly. That we'll be able to keep that up. So here's the question, the big mystery to me. Why don't more people do it? Everybody thinks we get thousands of applications every funding cycle. Actually, it's more like hundreds, which is a relief because I have to read them all. But still, I wonder, why isn't the number larger? Nobody would trade it for a job in a cubicle, significant chance of getting rich. Why don't more people start startups? Well, it turns out I can answer that question. One of the consequences of Y Combinator's position at the very beginning of the funding sequence is that we are the world's leading experts in the psychology of people who aren't really sure if they want to start a company or not. So I'm going to tell you why people don't do it, and I'm going to give you a sort of a checklist of reasons. Most people, when they're reluctant to do something, have 8 or 10 different motives mixed together in their heads in varying proportions. Some are real, some are fake. They don't even know what the proportions are, so they don't even know if their reluctance is mostly real or mostly bogus. So we're going to do the anatomy. I'm going to explain what the proportions are here. So, I've never given a talk with slides before. Okay, so this talk, I admit, the purpose is to raise your self-confidence. That worries me a little bit because most talks with that aim are kind of bogus. But there's 2 things different here. One is that I am motivated to be honest. I have to read all those damned applications, so if I encourage a bunch of lame people to start startups, it just means more work for me, weeding out our application pool. And also, my procedure here, instead of being positive, is to be negative. Instead of telling you guys, you can do it, I'm going to analyze the reasons you're not doing it and tell you which ones are real. Okay, so, the anatomy of reluctance in 16 parts. Number 1, you're too young. This is the reason everybody starts with. The median population worldwide is the median age in the world is 27, which means maybe a third of the population can legitimately claim that they're too young. So what's too young? Well, one of our goals with Y Combinator was to figure out the lower bound on the age of startup founders. What we figured out is not so much where it is, but how fuzzy it is. There might be some people who could do it at age 16. We don't look much past 18 because you can't legally form a corporation younger than that, I don't think. The youngest, the most successful founder we've had so far, though, Sam Altman, was only 19 when we funded him. Sam Altman, though, is an outlying data point. Sam Altman, when he was 19, was like he had a 40-year-old inside him. There are a lot of other 19-year-olds who have 12-year-olds inside them. They are not ready to start startups. So, how do you know? How do you know whether you're old enough or not? Well, there is a reason we have this separate word, adult. There is definitely a threshold you cross. And basically, you're ready to start a startup when you're an adult, no matter what your chronological age is. So how do you tell whether you're an adult? This is an interesting question. And I realized there are two techniques that adults use to tell whether somebody else is an adult. I realized this actually after talking to Sam Altman and thinking to myself, man, this guy seems like he's 40, not 19. What am I measuring here? You know, how can I tell he seems old? What is it that makes someone seem old? So I sat down and thought about it, and I realized there are two heuristics you can use. One is to check whether a person has the kid flake reflex. Little kids all know that if things get really hard, they can just say, I can't do it, will you do it for me? And that's like a magic button they can press. We'll get them out of all kinds of problems. They can just say, I'm just a kid. And that will even get them out of legal trouble right up till college age. So, do people have the kid flake reflex? Because like by definition, adults are not allowed to flake. They still do, but when they do, man, do they get in trouble. So, two is to test how the person responds to challenges from an adult. A kid, when challenged by an adult, will always respond in a way that it sort of implicitly recognizes the adult's dominant position. If you tell a kid, that's a stupid idea, the kid will either crawl away with his tail between his legs and say, yeah, I guess you're right, I don't know anything. Or he'll rebel and say, no, it's not, you're stupid. You never listen to me. But rebelling acknowledges the dominance of the person you're rebelling against just as much as submission does. The adult's response to that's a stupid idea is, really? Why do you think so? So, I don't know if you can apply these tests to yourself, but I'm pretty good at them, so if you're not sure, just come ask me. Number two, you're too inexperienced. I once wrote that I thought the right age for people to start startups was 23, and they ought to go work for a couple of years after college to get some experience first. Well, no, I don't agree with that. I was wrong. And what convinced me was the example of our own founders. I now think that the best thing you can do if you're too inexperienced to start a startup is start one anyway, because there is no better way to get experience. What convinced me of this especially was the example of the Kikos, right? They started a startup with Y Combinator right out of college, made a ton of mistakes due to their inexperience. A year later, they were ready to start again, and my God, they seemed fearsome, right? Much, much more fearsome than they would have seemed if they had spent that past year working as junior programmers at Microsoft or even Google, right? So, paradoxically, if you're too inexperienced to start a startup, the thing you should do is start a startup. Number three, that you're not determined enough. Well, that is a problem. I'm pretty determined. So determined, actually, that I have a hard time even imagining what's going on inside the heads of people who are not very determined. But there is some evidence that people who are not very determined exist. I feel kind of like Spock here, watching people laughing at the joke, right? They're not very determined, are they? I don't understand. Well, if you're not very determined, you probably shouldn't start a startup, because determination is the single biggest predictor of success in a startup. Number four, you're not smart enough. Actually, that's probably not a problem, surprisingly, because very few people underestimate their intelligence, right? So if you're smart enough to worry that you're not smart enough, you're probably smart enough. Also, frankly, like, I wish I could claim that being a startup founder meant you have to be super smart, because then I'd be super smart, right? But frankly, it doesn't. Silicon Valley can warp your perspective on this a little bit, because there's sort of a cult of smartness here. Everybody who's not smart at least tries to act that way. But if you think you need to be smart to get rich, I'll tell you what will cure you. Go and try hanging around for a few days in one of the fancier bits of New York or Los Angeles. Okay, so also, there's sort of a long tail of opportunities with respect to intelligence here. There's really opportunities for everybody. So if you're not smart, the enterprise business is not a technology business. It's a sales business. Sales depends mostly on effort. Okay, number 5, if you don't understand business. Well, I don't think that's such a huge problem because understanding business is not the hard part in a technology startup. The hard part is building a product that's actually good, people want to use, right? And so what matters is how good you are at building things, not how well you understand business. Once you build something good, you can figure out the business part on the fly. Now, I always get in trouble for saying things like this. People hate it when I say that, just build something great and don't worry about the money part. And yet, all the empirical evidence points in this direction. I mean, it's really hard to think of a company that made something amazingly popular and didn't make a lot of money out of it eventually. And also, acquirers tell me privately that the reason they buy startups is not for revenues. I mean, the startups they buy, they don't have any revenues. Did Google buy YouTube for revenues? The reason they buy startups is for strategic value, which means they made something people wanted. So, why do people give me such grief for saying you shouldn't worry about the money part? I think, largely, it's because they hate the idea that a bunch of smart-ass 20-year-olds, man, where's my slide at? That was an amusing slide. You took out the slide of the Reddits. Well, there was supposed to be this fabulous slide of the Reddits looking like they just got up in the morning. All right. I let the guys who made this presentation software fill around my presentation, and it looks like they deleted something. Anyway, there was supposed to be this great picture of the Reddit, and I was going to say, the reason people give me such grief for saying that you shouldn't worry about the money part is they hate the idea that a bunch of smart-ass 20-year-olds can make something great that doesn't make any money and get rich off of it. But how much they like it doesn't affect how true it is. Okay. Number 6, no co-founder. That is a real problem. We disagree with investors about a lot of stuff, but this one you will find everybody agrees about. There is no investor, at least no investor who's not an idiot, who would not prefer to invest in you with a co-founder rather than without. So, if you don't have a co-founder, what do? Get one, right? Everything else should go away. If you live somewhere where there's no co-founders, move where they are. If you have an idea that no one will work with you on, change your idea to someone that one will work with you on. The co-founder is more important than where you live or what your idea is, right? So that is the first order problem to solve. Get a co-founder. Preferably one you've known for a while and really trust. Number 7, you have no idea. We always say that it's not the idea that matters. All investors say that. It's not the idea, it's the team. Well, actually, most investors, it's like what other investors think and your Alexa numbers and then the team, right? You'll see when you talk to VCs. You'll see. But suppose you have no idea. Well, there is at least a sort of a practical problem, right? You want to start a startup and you have no idea, like what do you do? What does that first line of code actually do? Well, for people who are going to apply to Y Combinator, we have a special offer. We're going to try something new. In that field on the application form where it says, what are you going to do? You can now try saying, we have no idea. And if you guys seem good enough, we're going to accept you anyway, and we're confident that between us and you, we'll cook up something you can do. Because frankly, by the end of the 3 months, 80% of the average startup's idea is new anyway, so why not go for 100%? All right, but what do you do if you're not going to be in Y Combinator, right? Then what do you do? You still got this practical problem of having no idea. So here is the very brief recipe for ideas. Look at what's missing in your own life. What is wrong with your life? Is your life perfect? Probably not, or you wouldn't be doing something so inconvenient as starting a startup, right? So look at what's missing. No matter how narrow to you, no matter how specific it seems to you, that's still a better source of ideas than some hypothetical but very broad need, right? Steve Wozniak built himself a computer. Who knew how many other people would want one? It turned out a lot did, right? So even if the problem seems as narrow as you don't have a date on Saturday night, you can figure out some way to solve that problem by hacking. You're on to something. There's a lot of other people who have it too. All right, number 8, that there's no room for more startups. Oh, this is what the slide for Reddit As you see, I've learned about this. Okay, that there's no room for more startups. This is a fallacy. I wonder if I can slide my credits. Well, let's keep going. This is a fallacy. You don't hear it expressed directly. What you usually hear is something like, how many startups can Google, Yahoo, or Microsoft buy? Well, frankly, the reason they buy these startups, whatever you think about those other two acquirers, Google at least is not stupid, right? And the reason they buy these companies is because they're valuable. They're valuable, right? Google is not stupid. And so, as long as there are founders creating valuable things, and they're willing to forego the upside in return for some upfront payment, a market will evolve to buy them. You'll see. Markets are pretty clever that way. That slide was supposed to have been earlier. All right, number 9, you have a family to support. Well, I'm not going to argue with this one. If you have a family to support, I would not advise you to start a startup. That is not to say it's a bad idea. What I'm saying is I would not advise you to start a startup because I don't want the responsibility for telling you you should do it, right? Maybe you should do it, maybe you shouldn't, but I am not going to cross lines. If you have a family to support, the thing to do is start a consulting firm, get customers to pay you to build something you're actually going to make a product, and maybe you can turn yourself into a product company. Empirically, the chances of this working seem microscopically small, but at least you'll never be without income. Okay, number 10. This is my excuse for not starting a startup. If you already have enough money, why go through all the trouble of starting a startup? And in fact, for every so-called serial entrepreneur, there are 20 who are smart and think, why the fuck would I do that again? So, if you already have enough money, whatever's enough, you don't need to do it, right? Although it is kind of amusing. All right, number 11. This was my excuse for most of my 20s. I didn't want to do anything that required a commitment of more than a month, right? So if you're in the stage where you want to play in a band or go traveling around India or whatever, that's fine. That's a perfectly legitimate excuse. You don't have to start a startup. Don't worry about it. Okay. You have a need for structure. Interesting phrase. Think about what it means. What I think is, it's a nice way of saying that you need somebody to tell you what to do. Well, if you have a need for structure, you should probably not start a startup. In fact, you shouldn't even go work for a startup. Because in a startup, at least a good startup, nobody tells anybody what to do, at least until the company has like 20 people. There may be somebody whose job title is CEO, but nobody tells anybody what to do. Everybody just like does the right thing at any given time. If that sounds like a recipe for chaos, think about a soccer team. 11 people all do very complicated things together, and only under these very rare emergencies does anybody, usually the goalie, tell anybody what to do. A reporter once asked David Beckham if they had any language problems with Real Madrid, considering they were made by like taking the best player out of each country in the world. He said they all spoke different languages. And he said no, because they were all so good, they didn't have to talk, right? And that's what happens in a good startup. So everybody who says communication is important, they're saying something about themselves. They don't know what they're saying. All right, number 13, appropriately named, fear of uncertainty. One problem with starting a startup is you don't know what's going to happen. If you go to work for Microsoft, you can predict all too well what the next like 10 years is like. Whereas if you start a startup, my God, who knows what's going to happen? It might succeed, it might fail. Well, I can solve this problem for you. You're going to fail. All right? No more uncertainty. Actually, that's not a total joke. That's a reasonable way to approach the problem, right? You should like expect the worst, hope for the best. Maybe you'll get rich, probably it'll be a disaster, but at least it will be interesting. Number 14, you don't realize what you're avoiding. This is one reason we find 23-year-old startup founders on the whole tend to work a lot harder than 21-year-old startup founders right out of college. They know what they're avoiding. They know that if their startup fails, they're going to have to get a job, and they know how much jobs suck. If you're in college and you've had summer jobs or in technology companies, you probably think you know what a job is like, but you don't. If you've had a job, a summer job working as a waiter, that is a real summer job, right? That's cheap labor. You have to carry your weight. But a summer job working for a technology company is not a real job. That is part of the recruiting process, right? The goal is to meet people during college that they can hire after college. The real job comes after college, you know? And what you will discover is that most things most companies do are boring. And I remember, this is kind of an exciting thing. You graduate from college, and people will pay you huge amounts of money to do easier stuff than you paid money to do in college. You know, it seems great for the first couple of months, and then you realize you don't really have any choice about whether you're doing this easy, boring stuff, and you have to keep doing it month after month, right? The thing that I really hate about companies is that you're expected to be in a particular place at a particular time, even if you don't want to. Apparently, even Google is afflicted by this problem, you know? Every Sunday afternoon, you're thinking, oh God. And like, there are going to be times when you just do not feel like working, you know you're not going to get anything done, and you're going to go and sit in front of your computer and pretend to work anyway because of social pressure, right? That sucks. Well, let me tell you, in a startup, you're not going to work out of social pressures. Real pressures to make you work. So, if you want to know how much jobs suck, ask your friends. All right. Number 15. Your parents might be a doctor. Well, actually, this happens. You know, all you guys who are laughing, you're not Chinese, right? This actually happens a fair amount. I'm not going to argue with your parents. Families have their own traditions, and who am I to interfere? However, I will give you a couple reasons why your parents might not actually really want that. One, the parents always are too conservative on behalf of their kids. They have quite rational reasons for doing this. The kids share more of their misfortunes with their parents than their good fortunes. So, parents always err on the side of conservatism. However, as people who err on the side of conservatism never seem to realize, that's still erring, right? Err is not really the kind of word you can say with that. That's still screwing up. Risk is always proportionate to reward in almost any undertaking, right? And so, if you protect your kids from risks, you're also protecting them from rewards. And if parents saw things that way, maybe they wouldn't be so risk averse. Number two, the reason your parents want you to be a doctor is probably not solely out of benevolent reasons, right? It's not just because you're going to cure them sick. Otherwise, it would be fine if you were a nurse. But they want you to have a career that's rich and prestigious, right? And being a doctor is not as rich and prestigious as it used to be when their ideas about these things were formed. I remember back in the 70s, when I was a kid, there was this kind of magic triangle involving doctors, tennis, and Mercedes 450 SLs. All those vertices are now sounding a little dated. So I think, frankly, if you became the next Larry and Sergey, your parents would not be too bummed. Okay, number 16 is our last and most powerful force making you get a job. It's simply the default thing to do. And there is nothing more powerful than the choices you make without realizing you're even making a choice. Well, here's some reasons you might think about not doing it. Everyone thinks it's sort of an axiom. If you need money, you should get a job. An axiom for everyone except criminals. They have another plan. Plus, this axiom is surprisingly young. It's only about 100 years old, right? Before that, 100 years ago, the default way to make a living was by farming. And the people who went out to get jobs, working for corporations, an employee of someone else, that seemed really weird, you know? I think there's a similar change happening right now to the one that started in the Middle Ages when people left farms and started to go and work in cities, you know, for companies, for other people. I think there's another change happening now where instead of going to work for companies, people are going to start their own companies. It seems like this is something that very few people do. Everybody goes to get jobs, but only a few ever start them. I think a lot more people will be starting startups, and the only reason that seems odd is that it's unfamiliar. So, if it seems frightening to you, remember how frightening it seemed to your ancestors to leave their farms and go and do what you're doing now, right? Just imagine, we now think of medieval serfs as practically slaves. But in fact, there were no guards patrolling the perimeter of the village. It was easy for anyone who wanted to run away to the city. So what kept them from leaving? What kept them from leaving is that it seemed too risky, right? Leave your plot of land, your family farm for generations. go and live in this gigantic city of 3,000 or 4,000 total strangers? You know? How would you get food if you didn't grow it, right? Well, turns out there's a bunch of bagels sitting outside for anybody who wants it. Not everybody grows food. Your economy works so well that food is a commodity. So, if it seems frightening to you to start a startup, just imagine how frightening it seemed to your ancestors to stop being serfs. Probably all our ancestors were serfs at one point. Oddly enough, the people who know this best are the people who don't believe it. So how can Larry and Sergey tell you to come work as their employee when they themselves did not get jobs? I wouldn't be surprised if one day we look back on what we now consider a normal job, or if somebody looks back on what we now consider a normal job the way we look back on surfing, right? And we think, how did they endure it? Just imagine tilling the same plot of land your whole life, with no prospect of anything better. Giving all your surplus to a class of lords and priests you also had to acknowledge as your social masters. It's not so different, really, in a job. So imagine, in the future, looking back, how did they stand it, right? How did they endure getting up every Monday to commute to a job in a gray cubicle in a soulless office park, to be told what to do by a boss who could call you into his office and say, take a seat, and you'd sit like a dog. Imagine having to ask, there's going to be like 20 people in this audience who understand this, so please enjoy this while you can. Imagine having to ask permission to release software to users. Or imagine being bummed out on Sunday afternoons because you're going to have to wake up in the morning and go to work, even though you didn't want to. Well, if you can get yourself into a position where what everybody else treats as normal seems awful, that's probably a better position to be in. So that's a good reason to start a startup. Thank you very much.
Like 8-minute break. We're going to start back up at 11:15. Bathrooms are downstairs, and